would not bow to him. He plotted and planned, and he was going to destroy all the Jewish people. And by the time the story was ended, he had built a gallows to hang Mordecai on. And then what you find, right, is by the time it's done, the Lord turned it completely around, and Haman was leading Mordecai through the streets in robes of royalty, talking about how this was the guy that the king wanted to honor. And then by the time it was done, Haman, of course, was hung on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Now, we also read then on Wednesday night, we read about, as we studied Daniel, right? And how this very similar thing. Daniel lived righteously. Daniel was faithful to the job that he had. He was faithful to the laws of the land. Of course, he was in Babylon. And when people looked to find what they could accuse him about, they couldn't find anything. And they actually plotted and planned and said, if we're going to get something against Daniel, it's going to have to be something we do in relation to the God that he serves, because they knew that Daniel would never go against God. And so they created this rule and this plan, and it was all about you can't ask any petition of anybody except the king for 30 days. And of course, Daniel prayed 3 times a day. He'd done that before that law was passed. He did that when the law was passed, and he did that after, right? And of course, they plotted and planned, and they had him thrown in the lion's den. And yet the Lord protected him. And then those that had plotted and planned against him were the ones that ended up in the lion's den, right? So as you think about that, we're going to do one more example today, but we'll go ahead and read Psalms chapter 64 again, just to get the idea here. Psalms chapter 64, verse 1, "Hear my voice, O God, in my prayer. Preserve my life from fear of the enemy." Right? Preserve my life from the fear of the enemy. Hide me from the secret counsel of the wicked, those that are plotting and planning and you can't even see it. From the insurrection of the workers of iniquity. That word insurrection, of course, we talked about, means a tumultuous crowd, what we would call a mob of workers of iniquity. So verse 2 is asking the Lord to protect us from both those that are plotting and planning in secret and from the loud, boisterous mob. He goes on and he describes them who whet their tongue like a sword and bend their bows to shoot their arrows, even bitter words. So they're using their tongue as a weapon, and this is premeditated. They are sharpening it so it will cause more damage. They're bending their bows, and then in verse 4, that they may shoot in secret at the perfect. They're doing this hidden away in ambush, got their bow pulled back, got their story laid out, got their words planned, just waiting for that moment that they can execute that plan. In verse 5, they encourage themselves in an evil matter. They're lifting each other up. They're encouraging each other. They're saying, hey, this is going to work. They commune of laying snares privately, and they say, who shall see them? Man, they are out there laying traps, and they're set these up, and they're not going to fail because nobody's going to know they're coming. They search out iniquities. They accomplish a diligent search. Man, they are working hard at this thing. They are diligently searching out iniquities. And it's both inward thought of every one of them, and the heart is deep. This is no casual thing. They are putting a lot of thought and energy into this. And then verse 7, but God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. While they are laying their traps, while they are laying in ambush, waiting for those traps to be sprung, the Lord actually lets loose his arrow, and they are wounded. In verse 8, so they shall make their own tongue to fall upon themselves, and all that see them shall flee away. So in verse 8, so they shall make their own tongue to fall upon them. We talked about last time, they were whetting their tongue like a sword, right? They were sharpening it. And that thing that they were preparing as a weapon, that thing that they had sharpened to cause more damage, ends up falling back on them. And then in verse 9, and all men shall fear and shall declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider of his doing. So not only are the tables turned, but when the tables are turned and this world sees what God does, people have no choice but to consider what God has done. And whether they want to or not, God ends up getting the glory of it. But oftentimes when those things happen, there are some that see what God has done and they change, right? And then verse 10, the righteous shall be glad in the Lord and shall trust in him, and all the upright shall glory. Now, what I want you to do is take your Bibles, and we're going to turn back to the book of Daniel again. Daniel. And what we want to do is look at chapter 3, Daniel chapter 3. This again is not going to be a new story to you. It's going to be one that you've heard often, but I think it fits very well in regards to the ideas that you find in Psalms chapter 64. And so I want you to know again, the Bible is full of these examples of how the Lord can take all the plotting and planning of the wicked and just turn it completely around. But I also want to point out, in all three of these examples, these were faithful people. Mordecai trusted God. Daniel trusted God. And in this story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted God. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits, and he set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time then all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music. All the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now pause there for just a second. We know, because we've read this story before, that there are 3 people standing in this crowd. 3 people that already before Daniel chapter 3 had proven that they were faithful to God, right? Early on in Daniel and these 3 guys basically committed to serving God even in a foreign land. Even when they were surrounded by paganism, they committed to serving God. And they did some things in the very beginning of Daniel to show that they were going to be faithful to God. Now, can you imagine being those 3? You've been called together. It's this big deal. All the rulers are gathered together, and you're there, and there's this big golden statue. And suddenly you hear the herald yell out, "You have been commanded to bow down and worship this idol that the king has made. And if you don't, we're going to throw you into the furnace and burn you alive." Now, you have some really, really quick decisions to make. I mean, we read this story, but we seldom take the time to actually put ourselves in that situation. And can you imagine being there, right? You have dedicated that you are going to serve God, even in this foreign land. And now you have a decision to make. Because everybody else is about to fall down on their face and worship this thing. And listen, it's going to be obvious when you have a whole field of people and you got 3 of them that are not going to bow down. You're going to stick out, as the saying goes, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb, right? You're going to stick out like a sore thumb. And it's easy to sit here and go, well, they shouldn't bow down. And I agree, they shouldn't. But listen, in those moments, you are making a decision whether you are going to live or die. I mean, that's really what you have to be ready to decide in this case. It says in verse 8, "Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They have served not thy gods, nor worshipped the golden image which thou hast set up." Now I want you to notice something here. Tattletales. Tattletales. Like, okay, so the king apparently hasn't noticed these 3 guys that didn't bow down, but somebody's got to come and tell on them, right? So they come before the king and they say, hey king, you remember those Jews that you put in charge? Well, they didn't bow down. But listen, they actually, if you notice, they didn't just say that they don't bow down. They said, they have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, plural, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. I think these people had noticed other things that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had not done. Right? There was one statue. But they are accused of not serving the gods, plural. In other words, like Daniel, I think these guys already had a reputation for we are going to be faithful to the one true living God. In verse 13 it says, "The Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Now you think about this verse. You're standing in this huge crowd. You're told to bow when the music plays, or you're going to be killed. You don't do that. That's one thing. Now you are literally standing before the king. It's no longer we're out in this big crowd and maybe we won't stand out. You are literally standing before the king at this point, and he's saying, I'm going to give you one more chance. And when that music plays, I better see you on the ground. And if I don't, you will burn. And then ironically, he says, and what God is going to save you from me? You see the pride? I mean, there's massive amounts of pride right there, right? What God is going to deliver you out of my hands? I think that actually reflects that Nebuchadnezzar did many rulers in a lot of these pagan countries and others. They get to the point where they view themselves as a god, right? But you have to love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In verse 16 it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. We are not careful. In other words, we don't even have to put a lot of thought into this. And we're not going to be careful about what we say. We're not going to mince our words. We're not going to soft pedal this thing. We're not going to be diplomatic about it. We don't have to be careful in how we answer you because we already know the answer. It says in verse 17, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning, fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. Can you imagine standing before the king of the nation? By the way, a nation that has been very successful in conquering other nations. And a lot of the people standing before them, you can tell from the words, are actually people they've captured from other places and have brought in. And it says other nations and other languages, right? And yet as they stand before that king, they say, we don't have to be careful how we answer you. Matter of fact, the God that we serve, he is able to keep us and deliver us. Matter of fact, let's be more specific, he is able to deliver us from your hand. I mean, that's pretty direct. I don't know if you've ever noticed this when you've read the story, but this is always what stands out to me. It says in verse 18, and I think this is what's one of the most powerful parts about this story. It says in verse 18, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. We often think about, like Daniel and other stories where God provides amazing deliverance, or even later in the apostles and all the other stuff that went on, right? We often think about if we just have enough faith and trust, God will deliver us from whatever bad thing is about to happen, and we actually won't suffer. But you know what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they actually went further. They said, God is able to deliver us. We know that. He can. Now, whether he chooses to deliver us or not, we are still not going to disobey him. That's powerful. Because sometimes I think we get this idea, I'm going to have faith God's going to deliver me, and because I have faith God's going to deliver me, I'm going to go do it because I'm going to be okay. But faith is sometimes being willing to go do it even if you don't know if you're going to be okay. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That words there in those phrases literally means he was so angry, his visible form changed, like his face, you could see it. He was angry. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. This man is so angry, it's not good enough to burn them alive, but he wants the furnace heated 7 times hotter than it normally would be. I mean, he is angry. It says in verse 20, and he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, it might not make a lot of sense technically right now. Like, why did it have to tell us? Why did it take the time to tell us that they weren't only cast into the fiery furnace, but they were cast in with their hats on and their coats on and their cloaks and their garments? Like, that seems like an unnecessary detail. But it's important later when they come out and not a single thing on them was singed. Right? It's a miracle. Okay, but it says, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Literally, this thing is so hot that the people that throw them in die. Like, that's how hot this furnace is. And they throw them in, and they fall down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Verse 24. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men bound in the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. And he answered and said, Lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. The king, watching this, sees his mighty men die by simply throwing people into the fire. And yet, as he watches, those three that were thrown into the fire are up, moving around, and there's a fourth with them. And he is astonished. He is shocked. And listen to the change. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes and the governors and captains and the kings and counselors being gathered together saw these men, upon whose body the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. So, he goes from being so angry, he heats the furnace 7 times, he sees his mighty men killed, and he had earlier told them, there is no God that can deliver you from my hand. Right? But now he's at the mouth of the fire saying, hey, you three, you that serve the Most High God, come out. I want to talk to you. They went in bound. They come out unbound. Not even the smell of smoke. No singed hair. No garments touched. Right? And as they come out, it's witnessed by this all collection of these rulers that have been pulled together to do this. Rulers that bowed down, by the way, to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. Rulers that actually complained when these three didn't. And yet now the king has called them out. It says in verse 28, Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You imagine that? The king is now saying, hey, not only do you serve the Most High, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but blessed be the God, praised be the God who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him. Even Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that this was a thing of faith. They had faith in God, and they were willing to go even into the fiery furnace to serve him. And have changed the king's words and yielded their bodies that they might not serve or worship any god except their own God. Talk about a different tone. And he recognizes that they stood up and refused to obey even his commands. But I think he even recognized a change in himself. Like, what you guys have done, man, you have even altered my thought process. It says in verse 29, Therefore I make a decree, every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, I think you do need to take notice here that Nebuchadnezzar didn't say you can only worship this God, right? I think at this point Nebuchadnezzar is still a pagan king. Now, there's another chapter about him soon where he learns even a little bit more, okay? But he doesn't say in here that you can't worship other gods. He doesn't claim that he's only going to worship this God. But he does say that nobody can speak amiss about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. And he actually ends it by saying, he doesn't say that there is no other God. He says there's no other God that can deliver after this sort. Now, I do want you to think back in context of what Psalm chapter 64. What happens? They plot, they plan, they lay traps, and yet, when God intervenes, suddenly their own trap falls back on them. The king had to backpedal. All the stuff he claimed and all the things he was boasting of, in front of all of his rulers, he has to back up and say, no, there is a God that can deliver out of even my hands. His mighty men who were trying to throw somebody in are the ones that perished. And if you remember at the end of Psalm chapter 64, it says that when people see what God has done, they will fear, they will consider wisely, and God's going to be glorified. That's exactly what happened here. This king said, I've never seen anything like this. There is no other God like their God. There's nobody that can deliver like this God delivers. And let's see, I'm laying down a law right now that you better not say anything against their God. And if you do, you will be cut in pieces. I think this is a place of not only astonishment and wonder, I think you're also seeing some fear here. This is a guy that's saying, if God can do this, I don't want my people speaking against him, because, man, this God can do amazing things. Now, Nebuchadnezzar himself has some stuff to learn still, and there's another chapter that we'll get into sometime. But you see here, the Lord took his words and he just turned them around. Right? Just like Psalm 64 said that he can. You know, he doesn't always choose to do that. There are times in history, and there are things that we've seen, things that we see from the Scripture. You know, there are times where God may not deliver quite as miraculously as he did with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Do you have the faith to follow him even then? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were willing to, right? They were willing to. That's what I love. There's so much I love about this story, but that one right there, I always get caught up in that. You see so many times that idea of, hey, God's going to protect, we're going to follow him. But these guys said God can protect. We don't know if he will, but we're going to follow him anyways. Such a powerful, powerful example of faith here. And the Lord used it to show a whole nation that he is God. That he is God. Thankful to know that he does that. All right, we're going to go ahead and end with a word of prayer. Hopefully it's been an encouragement to you. I've enjoyed studying over this again. It's a neat story. All right, let's go to the Lord in word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all you've done